In the month of June 2024, an enraged mistress sat lying in wait outside a primary school. Entangled in an 8-year-long affair, she wasn't looking for answers. She was hunting down a rival, a hunt that would ultimately end in devastating tragedy. This documentary aims to present an honest and unfiltered account of the case surrounding Sharanjit Kaur. Sharanjit Kaur, a 40-year-old mother of 3, had been in a long-term relationship with a man identified in court only as Mr. R. The arrangement they had in place was messy and built on secrets. They lived together for 5 days a week, playing happy family. But for the remaining 2 days, Mr. R would return to his legal wife, Mrs. R, and their children. According to Kaur's defense, this double life was built on a foundation of reassurance. Mr. R had reportedly promised Kaur that his marriage was over and would divorce his wife as soon as Kaur divorced her own husband. Kaur, already facing deep judgment and isolation from her cultural community surrounding the affair, clung to these promises. However, these so-called promises cracked a few nights before the tragedy. Mr. R took his wife and kids out for dinner at an Indian restaurant in the Auckland suburb of Botany Downs, lying to Kaur about his whereabouts. While at the restaurant, they took a photo. In the frame, Mrs. R had her hand visibly resting on Mr. R, but even more crucially, she was wearing her wedding ring. On the morning of June 27, 2024, at approximately 8:40 a.m., the truth was revealed. As Mrs. R was attending a school assembly at Horsham Downs Primary School, just north of Hamilton, her husband called her in a panic. He told her Kaur had seen the photo and begged his wife to lie, asking her to say the picture was an old photograph. Mrs. R refused and confirmed it was recent. In the background of the call, she could hear Kaur shouting angrily before the line abruptly cut out. After the assembly finished around 10 a.m., Mrs. R walked to her car, a white Audi A3. As she passed Resolution Drive, she spotted a Toyota Land Cruiser parked on the side of the road. It was Kaur, which the Crown later described as lying in wait. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse on the open road. Kaur pulled out and began to stalk Mrs. R. She overtook her rival, pulled in front, and began an erratic pattern of slowing down and speeding up, brake-checking Mrs. R, a clear tactic of intimidation. Eventually, Kaur slammed on her brakes, stopping her massive Land Cruiser in the middle of both lanes and forcing Mrs. R to a halt. She then exited her vehicle, walked towards Mrs. R's car, and began hammering on the driver's side window. Terrified for her safety, Mrs. R managed to maneuver her car up onto a grass verge to escape, speeding away in a desperate bid for distance. But Kaur wasn't finished. Getting back behind the wheel to give chase, Mrs. R pushed her vehicle to approximately 120 kilometers per hour, trying to flee the enraged woman behind her. The chase turned onto Boyd Road in Gordonton, a straight stretch of tarmac that leads directly into a blind hill. Kaur, driving with what prosecutors called sustained rage, pulled into the oncoming lane to overtake, traveling on the wrong side of the road at speeds between 125 and 136 kilometers per hour. As the two vehicles crested the hill, there was no time to react. At the exact same time, Jonathan Michael Baker, known to friends as Jono, was driving a Mazda in the opposite direction. At 49 years old, Baker was a man who had dedicated his career to service. He was a respected staff member at the Department of Corrections, working as a team leader at community probation. His morning had been painfully normal, making coffee for his wife, Andrea, before telling her he loved her, giving a cheeky smile before heading out the door. He had stopped to visit an injured colleague and was on his way to drop his vehicle off for a service before heading to work in central Hamilton. Friends and family described him as a lovely and great man whose heart was all about making a difference. He was a devout Christian, a husband, and a pillar of his family. He had absolutely no connection to Kaur, Mr. R, or the toxic domestic drama heading directly towards him in the wrong lane. At the crest of Boyd Road, the inevitable happened. Kaur saw the oncoming Mazda and slammed on her brakes, but it was too late. Scrubbing off some speed, her vehicle slowed to approximately 109 kilometers per hour, but the impact was still catastrophic. The Land Cruiser collided head-on with Jonathan Baker's Mazda, rupturing Baker's aorta. He was killed instantly. The scene that followed was chaotic. Fire and emergency crews arrived at 10:08 a.m. and had to use heavy rescue equipment to extract Kaur, who was trapped in her wreckage with serious injuries. Mrs. R, who witnessed the horror unfold from her rearview mirror, was the one who called emergency services. When police arrived, initial reports were murky. Detective Inspector Daryl Harper noted early on that the drivers may have been involved in a dispute that began at the primary school, but as the accident reconstruction team did their work, the data told a damning story. This wasn't an accident caused by a moment of inattention. it was a collision caused by a persistent high-speed pursuit. When police interviewed Kaur, she attempted to cover her tracks with a mundane lie, saying she was simply running late for work. It was a falsehood that stripped away any veneer of immediate remorse. As the police investigation continued, they uncovered a disturbing pattern behind the wheel. Kaur was a driver with a history of disregard for the rules of the road, revealing she had accumulated 65 demerit points for past speeding offences. During one incident, she was clocked driving between 120 and 130 kilometers per hour. On February 17, 2025, 8 months after the crash, she appeared in the Hamilton District Court, charged with reckless driving causing death. She didn't enter a plea initially, but the weight of the evidence, the witness accounts, the phone calls, and the crash forensics was overwhelming. The legal reckoning arrived on July 2, 2025, before Judge Arthur Tompkins. Kaur had pleaded guilty, but the battle over her sentence was fierce, pitting two very different narratives against each other. Her defense lawyer, Anjit Singh, tried to paint Kaur as a victim of her own mind. She described the woman standing in the dock as deeply troubled and argued that the Indian restaurant photo was an inciting incident that caused a psychological collapse. A clinical psychologist supported this, stating that Kaur had reached a breaking point due to the convergence of chronic deterioration and acute stress. Singh pushed for a sentence of home detention, arguing that prison was not the answer for a woman broken by isolation and trauma. Crown Solicitor Casey Dillon refused to let the narrative shift, arguing that Kaur wasn't suffering a breakdown but was enraged. Dillon pointed to the persistent course of bad driving, the brake checking, the window hammering, and the high-speed chase as proof of intent. This wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a sustained attack. Dillon urged the judge to hand down a prison sentence, stating, "There was no defense to this charge. A conviction was inevitable." Judge Tompkins ultimately sided with the gravity of the offending. While he acknowledged the guilty plea, Sharanjit Kaur was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment and was disqualified from driving for 5 years. But the legal fight continued as Kaur appealed. On September 15, 2025, the case went to the High Court in Hamilton before Justice James McGillivray. Armed with a new lawyer, Matthew Goodwin, he argued that the sentencing judge failed to consider the causal link between Kaur's depression, cultural isolation, and the crash. He re-emphasized the point that the incident was a meltdown, not a simple spat of road rage, and that Kaur's 150 hours of community service prior to sentencing showed genuine remorse that was ignored. Crown Prosecutor Rebecca Mann stood firm, arguing there was no connection between cultural issues and driving at 136 kilometers per hour on the wrong side of the road. Just as Crown Solicitor Casey Dillon did during Kaur's previous sentencing, Rebecca also pointed at the high degree of persistence, the waiting, the stalking, the stopping, and the chasing as proof of deliberate reckless driving undertaken in a targeted way. Justice McGillivray ended up reserving his decision, leaving the final chapter of Kaur's punishment currently in suspension. The case of Sharanjit Kaur is a stark reminder of how quickly a private dispute can turn into a public tragedy. It juxtaposes the petty, sordid details of a domestic affair against the permanent, irreversible loss of a human life. For the family of Jonathan Baker, the pain is magnified by how needless the tragedy was. His widow, Andrea Baker, stood in court and admitted that while her faith taught forgiveness, she wasn't ready to offer it. "My heart is almost constantly consumed by his loss. You took a man out of this world whose heart was all about making a difference," she stated. The defense's argument raises uncomfortable questions for the justice system. Can emotional overload or cultural isolation ever be a mitigating factor for lethal behavior behind the wheel? Or, as the Crown argued, does the decision to stop, get out, get back in, and chase prove a level of intent that overrides any psychological defense? Ultimately, this story is a tragedy with no winners. A family is broken, a lovely and great man is now gone, and a mother of 3 sits in a prison cell, her life defined by a few minutes of blind, seething, unchecked rage. What are your thoughts on the defense of psychological collapse in cases of road rage? Does emotional trauma ever mitigate responsibility? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of often overlooked, lesser-known stories. Who else would you like to see us detail next? Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on otherwise unheard narratives.